John Williams had always been a smooth talker. He was married to Sarah, a military officer who worked long hours and was often away on duty. Their marriage, though solid on the outside, had an unspoken understanding. John was free to do as he pleased while Sarah was away, and she trusted him enough to never question his actions. But this trust was not something John appreciated as much as he should have. John had met Michelle, a lively and carefree woman, at a local bar one evening. She was young, attractive, and seemed to give him the attention he craved. Before long, their casual flirting turned into a full-blown affair. Michelle, though aware of John's marriage, was okay with the arrangement, believing it would be a brief fling. John, on the other hand, saw her as a secret getaway from his otherwise lonely marriage. He enjoyed the thrill of sneaking around, lying to Sarah, and keeping Michelle as his hidden little secret. Their relationship continued for several months, with John managing to keep the two women apart. Whenever Sarah was home, John would make sure to act like the loving husband, giving her the affection she craved. However, when Sarah left for her next mission, John would return to Michelle, indulging in their passion. He never thought the affair would come to any harm until the night everything changed. It was a Friday evening when John made the decision to break things off with Michelle. He felt guilty and anxious, realizing that his secret could no longer remain hidden. But Michelle wasn't ready to let go. She had grown attached to him, and her persistence in trying to keep the affair going started to become an annoyance to John. Her messages became more frequent, her calls more desperate. John couldn't handle it anymore. "You're wasting your time, Michelle," he had said that evening, his tone sharp as he told her that their affair was over. Michelle didn't take the news well. She threatened to tell Sarah everything. "If you leave me, I'll expose everything. I won't be your dirty little secret anymore," she said, her voice trembling with both anger and sadness. John's mind raced as the thoughts of losing everything swirled in his head. He had to stop her. He couldn't risk Sarah finding out about the affair. John's life as he knew it would be ruined, and he couldn't bear the thought of facing the consequences of his actions. That night, a dark thought began to form in John's mind. He would have to silence Michelle forever. The idea came slowly, almost like a whisper, but once it took hold, it felt like the only way out. He knew Michelle well enough to know that she wouldn't back down easily, but he was determined to make sure no one would find out about his infidelity. The affair had to end, and for it to truly end, there could be no trace left of Michelle. As John lay in bed that night, the weight of his decision pressed down on him, but he knew that once he acted, there would be no going back. He just had to be careful. John spent the next few days wrestling with his conscience. He hated what he was about to do, but the thought of losing Sarah, the life he had built with her, the respect he had in the community, was too much to bear. He convinced himself that Michelle had forced his hand, that she was the one pushing him to this point. He wasn't entirely convinced, but the thought of his military wife finding out about his affair was far more terrifying than anything else. The plan began to form slowly, almost methodically. John knew Michelle's habits. She liked to meet in private, at the rundown apartment she rented on the outskirts of town. It wasn't far from his place, and it was secluded enough to keep anyone from hearing or seeing anything unusual. John also knew that she often took walks in the nearby park after their meetings, a habit that would give him the opportunity to confront her privately without anyone around. John told himself that it would be quick, that he could just end the relationship with a single confrontation. He would make Michelle believe that he had come to his senses, that he no longer wanted anything to do with her. He would promise her whatever she wanted. He could even lie and say Sarah had forgiven him, that they could be together after all. Then when she was emotionally compromised, he would act. He just needed to get her alone, and everything would be over. The next few days passed in a blur of false smiles and fake affection with Sarah, who was about to leave for another military assignment. John made sure to play the loving husband, not wanting to raise any suspicions. He texted Michelle asking her to meet him again, saying he wanted to make things clear and to have one final conversation before they both moved on. "Meet me at the usual place," John texted Michelle. "We need to talk." Michelle responded almost immediately, eager to see him. "I'm looking forward to it. I need answers, John," she wrote back. John's heart raced with anticipation. He knew this would be the last time he saw her. He tried not to think too much about what he had to do. The logistics seemed simple enough. Get Michelle to meet him, make her feel that he was still interested in her, and then snap when she least expected it. He knew he had the skills to keep his cool, to make her believe whatever he needed her to believe. After all, he had lied to Sarah for months, convincing her that everything was fine. This would be no different. When Sarah left for her assignment on Friday morning, John felt a sense of freedom wash over him. He spent the rest of the day preparing for the meeting with Michelle. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard, to act anything less than convincing. He planned every detail. He would meet her in the park, take a walk with her down the path, and then, at the perfect moment, he would strike. By evening, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over the trees. John drove to the park early, parked his car a short distance away, and waited. His hands shook slightly, but he forced himself to breathe steadily, telling himself this would be the last time he had to do something like this. Michelle would never be a problem again. He felt both guilty and relieved, as if the weight of the affair was about to be lifted from his shoulders. Michelle arrived shortly after, walking down the path, her face lighting up when she saw him. She smiled and waved, and John returned her greeting with a forced smile. They exchanged pleasantries, and for a brief moment, it almost felt like everything was normal. But John knew better. They were standing on the edge of something terrible. "I'm glad you came," John said, his voice calm but tight. "I needed to talk to you about everything." Michelle looked up at him, her face filled with confusion and anticipation. "John, what's going on? You said you wanted to make it work between us. Why all of a sudden?" "I've been thinking a lot," John interrupted, his voice steady. "It's over, Michelle. This thing between us, it's not going to work. I'm going back to my wife. I've made a decision." Michelle's face fell. She looked at him with disbelief, almost as if she couldn't understand what he was saying. "You can't be serious, John. You said you loved me. You said we could have a future together." John looked at her coldly. "That was before I realized what I had to lose. I can't be with you anymore. I've made a mistake, and I'm ending it now." Michelle's eyes filled with tears, and she stepped closer, reaching out to him. "You can't just leave me like this. You owe me, John. You promised me a future. You can't just walk away and pretend this never happened." For a split second, John almost felt guilty. But then the thought of Sarah, his wife, popped into his head, and the fear of being exposed reignited the fire inside him. He couldn't let Michelle ruin everything. She was a loose end that needed to be tied up. The conversation became heated as Michelle began to demand answers. She yelled at him, called him a liar, but John's mind had already made the decision. The tension between them grew, and in a split second, John snapped. Without a word, he grabbed her by the arm and pulled her toward the dense part of the park, where the trees hid them from view. The plan he had in his mind went into action. The forested area of the park felt eerily quiet as John dragged Michelle deeper into the trees. The path was becoming narrow, the rustling of leaves almost deafening in the silence between them. Michelle, still in disbelief, was trying to talk to him, her words a mix of pleading and anger. She couldn't comprehend what was happening. Her voice grew louder as she struggled against his grip, but John's resolve was firm. He could hear the panic in her voice, but his focus was on the task at hand. "John, please, don't do this. We can work things out," Michelle cried out, trying to pull away from him. "You don't have to do this. I love you. I thought you loved me too." But John didn't respond. His mind was made up, and every word she said only served to fuel his anger. He had to shut her up, stop her from talking. The thought of her telling Sarah everything, ruining his life, gnawed at him. His palms were sweating, his heart racing in his chest. But there was no turning back now. They stopped in a small clearing, where the thick trees provided enough cover. Michelle was gasping for air, still trying to process the situation. She was too emotional, too unsteady to see what was coming. Her eyes were wide with panic now, and she took a step back, her hand trembling as she reached into her purse. "What are you doing?" John asked, his voice dangerously low. He was beginning to feel the weight of his decision, but the fear of exposure pushed him forward. He couldn't afford hesitation. "I'm calling Sarah. She'll know what to do." Michelle snapped, her voice wavering but defiant. She fumbled with her phone, clearly desperate to turn the situation in her favor. John's blood ran cold. He couldn't let her make that call. Without thinking, he lunged at her, knocking the phone out of her hand. It hit the ground with a loud crack. He heard Michelle scream, the sound full of raw panic as she turned to run. But John was faster. He grabbed her by the wrist, pulling her back into his grip. "Stop!" John hissed through gritted teeth, his breath ragged with the mounting tension. "You're not calling anyone." Michelle began to struggle even harder, her eyes wide with terror. "John, no! You don't have to do this," she pleaded again, her voice rising. "I swear, I won't tell Sarah anything. I'll leave you alone. Just let me go." For a moment, John hesitated, his mind racing. But then the image of Sarah, his wife, the one he had built a life with, flashed in his mind. If Michelle went to the police, or even just told Sarah, everything would come crumbling down. John couldn't allow that. He had to protect himself, and the only way to do that was to silence Michelle permanently. In one swift motion, John reached into his pocket and pulled out the knife he had brought with him. His hands trembled as he brandished it, but his grip tightened. Michelle saw the blade and froze for a second, her face contorting with terror as the realization set in. "No, John, please!" she cried, her voice breaking. "Please don't do this. I was just trying to love you. I thought we could have something together." But John's mind was clouded with fear and rage. He wasn't thinking about love or guilt anymore. He was thinking about his future, his family, and everything he had to lose. With a quick movement, he lunged forward, plunging the knife into Michelle's side. She gasped in shock, her eyes wide, before she crumpled to the ground in a heap. Michelle's body twisted, and she let out a low, pitiful cry. But John didn't stop. He drove the knife deeper, each stab more frantic than the last. Blood began to pool around her as her body convulsed in pain. Her hands scrambled weakly for purchase, but there was no strength left in her. John watched as the light slowly drained from her eyes, her breathing becoming more erratic. Then still, it was over. He stepped back, panting heavily, his chest rising and falling in the aftermath of his violent actions. His hands were coated in blood, his mind numb with the shock of what he had just done. But even as the weight of the situation began to settle in, he felt a strange sense of calm. He had done it. He had silenced Michelle for good. There was no going back now. John stood over Michelle's lifeless body, staring down at her for a long moment. His thoughts were a blur. Part of him was horrified by what he had just done, but another part was already planning how to cover his tracks. He couldn't let anyone find out. He had to make it look like something else, something that wouldn't point back to him. He quickly checked her pockets, taking her phone and throwing it into a nearby stream to make sure no evidence was left behind. The park was empty this time of night, and he had made sure no one had been around when he attacked her. He had to leave quickly, get back to his car, and make it home before Sarah returned. No one could know what had happened here. John wiped the blood from his hands onto the grass and turned to leave. The next morning, the sun rose over the city, casting a pale light over the park where Michelle's body was discovered. A jogger, who had taken a usual route through the woods, had stumbled upon her lifeless form. The police were called immediately, and the scene was cordoned off. It wasn't long before detectives from the local precinct arrived to begin their investigation. Detective Linda Barnes, a seasoned investigator with over a decade of experience, was assigned to the case. She had seen many murders in her career, but something about this one felt different. The brutality of the crime, the lack of a clear motive, and the absence of any witnesses all made it difficult to piece together. As she stood over Michelle's body, she took note of the stab wounds, multiple deep cuts to the chest and abdomen. The victim was young, and the blood around her indicated she had been killed only hours before. Michelle's face was frozen in a mixture of shock and terror, her hands still clenched in an attempt to defend herself. There were no signs of sexual assault, but it was clear she had been murdered in cold blood. Barnes knew that time was critical. The longer they waited, the harder it would be to uncover the truth. She ordered her team to search the surrounding area, looking for any evidence that could lead to the perpetrator. They found nothing unusual on the surface. No weapon, no obvious signs of a struggle, and no immediate suspects. But Barnes had a hunch that this wasn't a random attack. Michelle hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The brutal nature of the murder and the fact that the body had been left in a secluded area pointed to something personal, something driven by emotion. As the investigation progressed, the first lead came in the form of Michelle's phone. After some effort, the police were able to retrieve it from the nearby stream where it had been tossed in an attempt to destroy evidence. The phone had a history of recent calls and messages, and it wasn't long before the name John Williams appeared on the screen. There were multiple texts between Michelle and John, mostly romantic, but some more recent messages suggested tension in their relationship. One message, sent the night before, stood out. Michelle, you can't just leave me like this, John. I will tell Sarah everything if you don't commit. That message raised red flags. It implied that Michelle had been in a relationship with a married man, and she had been threatening to expose him. Detective Barnes knew that such a motive was enough to make someone snap, but the key question was whether John Williams was the murderer. She would need to dig deeper. The next step was to track down John. Barnes pulled up his background, and it didn't take long to confirm that he was indeed married to a woman named Sarah, a military officer who had been away on assignment for the past few weeks. That detail stood out to Barnes. It seemed like the perfect cover for an affair. She decided to visit John's house to see if he could provide any insight into Michelle's life, and more importantly, his relationship with her. At the same time, Sarah Williams was informed of her husband's potential involvement in the case. The police had learned that she was unaware of the affair and was understandably shocked by the news. Detective Barnes knew that Sarah's cooperation could be crucial, so she made arrangements to meet with her. But first, she needed to talk to John. By noon, Detective Barnes and her team arrived at the Williams home. It was a modest, well-kept house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Barnes rang the doorbell, and after a moment, John answered. He was dressed casually, his eyes a little red, as if he had barely slept. His demeanor was calm, but Barnes noticed a slight unease in his posture. She introduced herself and explained that she needed to ask him some questions regarding the death of Michelle. "Of course, Detective," John said, inviting her inside. "I'm still in shock about this. I don't know why anyone would hurt her." Barnes nodded, her eyes scanning the room for anything that might hint at John's guilt or innocence. "I understand this must be difficult for you, Mr. Williams. I just have a few questions about your relationship with Michelle." John stiffened slightly but quickly recovered. "I don't know what to tell you. I met her a few months ago, but it wasn't serious. We had an affair, but I ended it recently. She didn't take it well." Barnes kept her voice steady, watching him closely. "What exactly happened between you and Michelle the night she died? Did you see her?" John hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I didn't. I was at home all evening, alone. My wife is out of town, and I've been trying to keep busy with work. I hadn't seen Michelle in a few days before the police contacted me." Barnes took a mental note of his story. Detective Barnes spent the following days meticulously piecing together the timeline of events. John Williams had presented himself as a grieving husband, shocked by Michelle's death, but her instincts told her that he was more involved than he was letting on. She knew that the key to cracking this case lay in the details. Barnes and her team began by focusing on the cell phone data. Michelle's phone had been retrieved from the stream, and although it had suffered some water damage, the data from her calls and texts were intact. The investigation into her communications revealed several troubling patterns. The messages between her and John were frequent, but one particular exchange, sent the evening before her death, stood out. "Michelle, I'm not letting you go this easily, John. If you think I'll just disappear after everything we've been through, you're wrong. I'll tell Sarah everything. I'll make sure she knows." The timing of this message was crucial. It suggested that Michelle had been on the verge of exposing John, and she had been threatening him with the truth. Barnes couldn't help but wonder if John's growing desperation had led him to make the fatal decision to silence Michelle. Her team worked quickly to verify his alibi. John claimed he had been alone at home the night of the murder, but no one could corroborate his story. He had no security cameras, and there were no other witnesses who could place him anywhere but his house. With no concrete evidence linking him directly to the crime scene, Barnes knew that circumstantial evidence wouldn't be enough to charge him. She needed more. Then something significant happened. One of Barnes's team members, Officer Davis, found an interesting detail buried deep in the phone records. The number of a local taxi service had appeared multiple times in Michelle's call history, but one call stood out. It was placed just minutes after the time John had claimed to be alone at home. The taxi had dropped Michelle off at a location not far from the park where her body was found. The timing was precise. It suggested that Michelle had been in the area shortly before her death. More importantly, it also suggested that Michelle had met with someone after she had been in contact with John. Barnes's mind raced. If John was truly at home, then who had Michelle met after their conversation? And why hadn't John mentioned this during his interview? She pulled up surveillance footage from nearby businesses that had cameras aimed at the park entrance. It took hours to sift through the footage, but eventually they spotted something that sent a chill down Barnes' spine. A man in dark clothes walking toward the park shortly after Michelle had arrived. The man's face was obscured by a hat and sunglasses, but his build matched John's. Barnes immediately put out a call to check for any other footage that might capture the man's face. It was a long shot, but she couldn't ignore the possibility that they were looking at a potential lead. Meanwhile, Sarah Williams, John's wife, had returned from her military assignment. Detective Barnes arranged to meet with her the following day to discuss her husband. The news of Michelle's death had clearly shaken Sarah, and she seemed genuinely distraught. Still, Barnes had questions. At the meeting, Sarah sat across from Barnes in a quiet cafe, her military uniform pressed and clean, but her face was drawn, tired. It was clear that the last few days had been emotionally exhausting for her. She had been blindsided by the affair, and now she was grieving a woman she didn't even know. "I just don't understand," Sarah said softly, her voice breaking. "Why would he do this? John never seemed the type to have an affair, let alone murder someone." Barnes studied Sarah carefully, trying to gauge if she had any insight into her husband's behavior. "I know this is hard, Mrs. Williams, but I need to ask you some difficult questions. Did John ever mention any issues with Michelle? Did he seem upset or distant in the days leading up to her death?" Sarah thought for a moment, her eyes focused on the table. "Number. He never talked about her directly, but he did seem different recently, more stressed. I thought it was just the pressure of work. He's been distant at times, but I just thought it was because of everything going on in his life. I never suspected anything like this." Barnes noted her response. "Did you ever see any signs that he might be hiding something? Any strange behavior? Anything that didn't add up?" Sarah shook her head. "No, I honestly didn't. He's always been a little reserved, but I trusted him. I had no reason to doubt him." Barnes knew Sarah wasn't withholding information, but she also knew that sometimes even the closest people couldn't see the truth when they didn't want to. She leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle but firm. "Mrs. Williams, I believe your husband has been involved in Michelle's death." Detective Barnes sat at her desk, staring at the enhanced footage of John Williams entering the park the night of Michelle's murder. It was as clear as day now. The man in the footage, though wearing a hat and sunglasses, had the same build as John. His gait, the way he moved, it was unmistakable. John had lied. He hadn't been at home, alone as he had claimed. He had been at the scene of the crime, moments before Michelle's death. Barnes knew that she was approaching the point of no return. This was it, the breakthrough she'd been waiting for. She now had undeniable proof that John had been involved in Michelle's murder. The next step was to confront him directly and bring him in for questioning, but she had to be careful. John was a seasoned liar, and he would do everything in his power to cover his tracks. That afternoon, Barnes gathered her team for a final briefing. "We've got him," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of urgency. "We've identified John Williams as the man seen entering the park the night Michelle was killed. His alibi has fallen apart. He was not at home as he claimed. We also have his phone records and Michelle's last texts, and they show a clear motive." Barnes paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "We're going to bring him in for questioning. I want a clean interrogation. No mistakes. We need him to crack under pressure." Her team nodded in agreement. They were all ready for this moment. Detective Barnes had been in countless confrontations, but there was something about this case, the lies, the affair, the murder, that made this one personal. She couldn't let John walk free, not after everything he had done. An hour later, Barnes arrived at the Williams house. She rang the doorbell, her heart pounding in her chest. When John answered, his face immediately froze, the color draining from his cheeks. He knew without a doubt that something was wrong. "Detective Barnes," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's going on? Is this about Michelle?" Barnes nodded. "Yes, Mr. Williams. We need to speak with you about the murder of Michelle Anderson. We've gathered evidence that places you at the scene, and we believe you're involved in her death." John's expression flickered. Fear, then defiance. "I already told you I didn't do anything. I wasn't even there." Barnes took a deep breath, pushing aside her personal frustration. "We have surveillance footage, Mr. Williams. It shows you entering the park the night Michelle was killed. It shows your face, your walk. It's over. We have the proof." John's eyes darted nervously, his pulse quickening. He tried to maintain composure, but it was clear that the walls were closing in on him. "This is insane. You've got it all wrong. You don't know what you're talking about." "Then explain this," Barnes said, sliding a file across the table. Inside was the phone data showing the messages between John and Michelle. She highlighted the threatening text Michelle had sent the night before the murder. John's face paled, but he quickly recovered, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. "That's just her trying to control me. She was crazy. I told her it was over. I didn't want anything to do with her anymore." Barnes leaned in, her voice calm but firm. "You say it was over, but Michelle didn't believe you. She was threatening to expose your affair, John. You didn't want that, did you?" John opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His eyes shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Barnes could feel the shift in the air, the moment when the truth would either break free or remain locked inside. "Did you kill her, John?" Barnes asked, her voice cutting through the tension. "Did you kill Michelle to protect your secret?" John's breath caught in his throat. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze dropping to the floor. The room felt smaller now, the weight of the question pressing down on him. His fingers clenched the edge of the table, but he didn't answer right away. Barnes could see the internal battle in his eyes. Finally he spoke, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to hurt her," he said, his words stumbling out. I couldn't let her ruin everything. I couldn't let her tell Sarah. If Sarah found out, I would lose everything, my wife, my life. It all would have been over." Barnes remained silent, allowing him to continue, her eyes never leaving his face. She could feel the truth slowly unraveling before her. "I went to see Michelle that night. I didn't mean to hurt her. I just wanted to talk. I told her I was done, that she needed to leave me alone. But she wouldn't listen. She kept threatening me. She said she'd tell Sarah everything, that she'd destroy my family. I lost control. I didn't know what to do. She was crying, yelling at me, and I just snapped. I grabbed the knife and I don't know what happened after that." The trial of John Williams was the talk of the town. The once respected businessman, who had managed to maintain a spotless image for years, now stood as the accused murderer. The case had captured the attention of not only the local community, but also the media, who were eager to report on the fall of a seemingly perfect family man. Sarah Williams, John's wife, sat in the courtroom every day, her face a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. She had learned of his affair, the lies and the murder, all in the span of a few harrowing weeks. The woman who had once been married to a man she thought she knew now struggled to reconcile the man in front of her with the husband she had loved for years. The prosecution's case was built on the evidence Detective Barnes had uncovered: the surveillance footage, the phone records, and most crucially, John's confession. The defense tried to argue that John had acted in a moment of temporary insanity, overwhelmed by stress and fear of losing everything, but the jury was not moved. As the trial progressed, Sarah's internal struggle only deepened. Every day she sat in the courtroom, eyes locked on the man she had once called her partner, but now she couldn't recognize him. His once charming demeanor had been replaced by an air of defeat. His posture slumped, his eyes hollow with guilt. Every time he spoke, his words seemed to cut deeper into Sarah's heart, a reminder of the trust that had been shattered beyond repair. But it wasn't just John who had to face the consequences of his actions. Sarah, too, had to come to terms with the devastation his betrayal had caused. She had been serving her country in the military, and while she had been away, John had managed to weave a life of lies and deceit. She had always believed in the strength of their relationship. That distance could not break their bond. But now she saw that her trust had been nothing more than a fragile illusion. Detective Barnes continued to follow the case closely. The trial was emotionally draining for her as well. She had been the one to uncover the truth, but the reality of what had happened weighed heavily on her. She had seen countless criminals, but something about this case felt different. John's actions had been driven by fear, desperation, and greed. But in the end, it was Michelle, an innocent woman who had paid the ultimate price. Barnes attended every day of the trial, watching John squirm under the weight of his lies. At times, she couldn't help but wonder how far he might have gone to cover up his affair. Had it truly been a spur-of-the-moment decision, or had he been planning to kill Michelle all along? The fact that he had left so many clues behind suggested that he had believed he could control the situation, but once he had crossed the line, there was no turning back. On the final day of the trial, the jury delivered their verdict, guilty. John Williams was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge's gavel fell, Sarah finally broke down in the courtroom. The years of pain, betrayal, and confusion had all led to this moment. Her husband, the man she had loved and trusted, was now a convicted murderer. After the trial, Sarah spoke briefly with the media. Her voice was calm, but her words were heavy with sorrow. "I never imagined my life would end up like this," she said, her eyes red from crying. "I loved John, and I thought I knew him. But now I know the truth. And the truth is, he killed someone to protect his lies. It's a pain I will never be able to escape." Sarah left the courthouse without speaking to John. She didn't need to. There was nothing left for her to say to him. The man she had once called her husband had been stripped of everything: his freedom, his reputation, and the family he had built. And Sarah? She had to rebuild her life from the ground up. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new routine for Sarah. She was still serving in the military, trying to find some sense of stability after the turmoil that had engulfed her. It wasn't easy. Every day felt like a battle, between grief and anger, betrayal and forgiveness. But slowly she started to piece together her life again. She found comfort in the people around her friends and her colleagues, who supported her through the darkest times. Barnes, meanwhile, found herself reflecting on the case long after it had been closed. She had done her job, uncovered the truth, and brought a killer to justice. But there was still something haunting about the entire ordeal. She had seen too many cases where betrayal and lies led to murder, but something about this case felt personal. Maybe it was because John Williams had been so ordinary, so seemingly harmless, and yet capable of such horrific actions. It made her question everything she thought she knew about human nature. One evening, as Barnes sat in her office reviewing the final reports, she received an unexpected call.